by David Halberstam. That's followed by The Century. ABC's Peter Jennings and Life magazine reporter Todd Brewster chronicle the past century through the lives of ordinary citizens. The authors will be our guests for History on Book TV March 13th at 8 and 11 p.m. Eastern. And finally, Conversations with God, An Uncommon Dialogue, Book 1 by Neil Donald Walsh. You're watching Book TV. 48 hours of programs about books, authors, and the publishing industry. Every weekend, here on C-SPAN 2. Many books are being published this year about the upcoming millennium. Author Robert Lacey has taken a different slant, looking at the last millennium. His book is called The Year 1000, What Life Was Like at the Turn of the First Millennium, An Englishman's World. It discusses what life was like in England for the average man and woman in the year 1000, how they lived, what they ate, about their views on life. Mr. Lacey recently spoke about his research at Borders Books in Grosse Pointe, Michigan.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to Borders tonight to meet Robert Lacey. As many of you know, he had written Ford, The Man and the Machine, and lived in our community with us for quite a few years. And now he has written The Year 1000, and I'd like to thank him for coming, and thank you for coming to greet him.
Thank you very much. Yes, it is a great pleasure to be back in Grosse Pointe. Thank you very much. I did live here with my family for nearly 3 years back in the 80s when I was writing about the Ford family. It's nice to see so many old friends and faces here. It's also a great delight for me to be on C-SPAN. Of course, now there are no impeachment hearings. They had to fill up the screen with something, and I'm very honored. I'm very honored that, well, I should do my best to live up to all the drama, incitement, and importance of what's been going on for so long. I'd like to start off with a quotation from one of my royal books. I see one or two people here have brought Majesty and other books that I wrote previously about the royal family. And this is a little piece of research I came across when I was writing a book on the Princess of Wales, actually the first biography of the Princess of Wales in rather happier times. And this is what I found in the Nigerian Sunday Times for June 1981. Sort of sets a theme for what I'm going to talk about this evening. The Nigerian Sunday Times told its readers, the wedding of Prince Charles to the Lady Diana Spencer is due to be consummated next week in St. Paul's Cathedral by the Archbishop of Canterbury and a team of other top clergymen. Well, when I started my writing career, I thought you just need a good subject and the rest follows. Well, you can see that choosing the right word for the occasion is also important. And so I'm going to share with you a few of the things that I learned along the way writing with my co-author, Danny Danziger, this book, The Year 1000. The idea came to both of us, and I'm a journalist and he is a journalist, because we kept coming across these articles about the year 2000 and what was going to happen in the year 2000 or what wasn't going to happen in the year 2000. And it struck us that these were boring, that they were speculative. And it would be much more interesting to find out about the other millennium that actually happened and to discover what happened then and perhaps to draw some lessons from it. Now, of course, it's not altogether fashionable nowadays to draw lessons from history, but I'm afraid I'm rather old-fashioned about my history. I actually grew up on a book that I don't know if it's known in America. It was a history book for children in England by a man called H.E. Marshall, and it was called Our Island Story. And it was a simple story and terribly politically incorrect story of great heroes, great strapping English heroes who went around the world laying down their cloaks so that their queens should not get their feet dirty in puddles. But it told a story, and it interpreted history in terms of characters and personalities, and its premise was that people make a difference to history and to events. And the other book that influenced my writing in history was a book called 1066 and All That, which was a sort of spoof on this sort of history. And made fun of the idea of good kings and bad kings and talked about wicked King John who lost all the crown jewels in the wash and that sort of thing. And I like that because it made history funny, and it reminded us that human beings are funny, and we shouldn't perhaps get too reverent about our history. So that was the theme that Danny Danziger and I took for writing the year 1000. We decided that we wanted to find out the things that the history books don't tell you all the time. What made people laugh? What did people take to cure their headaches? In an age without paper, what even rude things like, you know, what did people use to wipe their bottoms? We decided that since of the two of us, Danny knew much less about history than I did, that he was the obvious person to go and ask these questions. Also, like all journalists, he has a certain oily charm and rat-like cunning, and he therefore made it his job to go out and talk to about 40 or 50 of the top academics and archaeologists of English history about the year 1000, and ask them these rather direct and impertinent questions. Perhaps I should explain why we concentrate in this book on England, and I should be talking tonight about England in the year 1000. To start with, we did think we'd try and cover the whole world, and then we realized very rapidly that was too big a task. But more important, of course, most of the world in the year 1000 didn't know it was the year 1000, because the year 1000 is a Christian date. For Muslims, it was the year 300 and something. There was a Buddhist calendar already. There was a Hindu calendar. There's a Jewish calendar, of course, going far further back. And since part of the object of our exercise was to look at the millennium and how people thought and felt about this concept of 1,000 years, by definition, the book had to concentrate on Christendom. And then, as we concentrated on Christendom, we discovered that in the year 1000, although the English were using this system of the Anno Domini, which we now all use today, the years of our Lord, even at the time of the first millennium, much of Christendom still wasn't using this system. The papacy, for example, the papacy itself in the year 1000 was actually using the old original system of dating from the reigns of Roman emperors. And in Spain, half of it dominated by the Arabs, half ruled by the Christians, they had a different system of dating as well. And so partly because we were English, but mainly for this reason, and also because all books need a focus, we decided to concentrate on England in the year 1000. And so Danny Danziger, my co-author, went off and asked these impertinent questions and came back to me with a mountain of wonderful material. And then it fell to me, as the writer who knew a little bit about history, to try and turn this material into a book. And that's when we encountered the next difficulty, because, as I've explained, we didn't want to write an ordinary history book. We didn't want to write a book about farming in the year 1000, towns in the year 1000, or even latrines in the year 1000. We wanted some different sort of structure. And it puzzled me and held me up for several months, classical writer's block. And I suddenly thought, well, let's get back to basics. I live in London, I work in London. Let me go to the British Museum, to the British Library, and ask to see some documents, some real things from the year 1000, and maybe that will inspire me. And that was when I went to the air-conditioned manuscript room of the British Museum and came across this document, which is reproduced here, which is known as the Julius Work Calendar. Now, you can see already from this that it's a parchment document. It comes from actually the year 1020 or thereabouts. It was drawn up by a scribe in Canterbury Cathedral. You can tell it's parchment because, do you see how it's sort of scrunching up like this? Because parchment is made from the skin of baby lambs and baby kids. And after a few years, it starts to try and take back the shape of the little animal from which it came. And in fact, this is a restored, this version has been, when I say this version, this is the original. This has been restored, and actually what we're looking at here around the edge, apart from these colors, is modern restoration work. This is how the original parchment has gone back into its shape. Now, there are 12 pages of this calendar, and when you actually look at it and understand it, it's curiously modern. Here at the top, is the sign of the zodiac. We're looking here at the month of January, the calends of the month of January. And there is a little goat, which of course is Capricorn, the sign of the zodiac for the month of January. Down here are the dates, one for each day of the month. And the writing here, in fact, in Latin, is the name of the saint that one has to pray to on that particular day. So it's obviously old and religious, as you might expect from the Middle Ages. But then across the bottom here, you get the reason why it's called a work calendar. Here is your task for the month. So it is just like a modern calendar. Here's your task for the month in January. You have to plow. And here, in fact, is a sketch, and I'll be showing you more of these, a sketch of a plowman in the year 1000 working. Let's move on and see if I'm as technologically backward as some people were in the year 1000. Let me just see if we can get the next one. We're going the wrong way. There we are. Oops. Oops. It's a sunset. Oops, sorry. And this is all going on live television. What's happening here? What's happening? The thing's only capable of going backwards, isn't it? There we go. There we are. Here we are. Thank goodness. Thank the Lord. Here we are in the month of May. Here are sheep at the bottom. Here is the sign of the zodiac, and here once a day you've got the you can actually see perhaps some of you Maius, M-A-I-U-S. Now this entire document is in fact in Latin, and when you translate it, it's actually all rhyming verse, and it's a sort of it was the way the young monks were taught. It's rhyme, how they were taught the calendar and which saints attached to which day. It sort of goes, in English, it would go something like Solomon Grundy, born on a Monday, christened on Tuesday. It's sort of doggerel. And one can imagine the young monks in a monastery in the 11th century learning off the 365 lines of verse, thus learning the calendar and also at the same time learning which saint they should pray to on that particular day. There we are, we've gone back to January. Here we are in May. Press the right button again. Oops, will it happen? No, it doesn't seem to want to go forward very much, this machine. Can you give it a hand there, perhaps? Yes, push the button, see what happens there. Try it once more. One more, and otherwise we may have to abandon this exercise. Right. Ah, marvelous, thank you very much. Now here is a close-up. Here is a close-up of the drawing for the month of January. Here you see you have to plow. Now can you press the button once again, and let's move on again. Much better than me doing it. Here is February, and in February you start to prune. And just think of the importance, the symbolic importance of what pruning means, because when you think about it, pruning is the way by which man or woman takes a wild plant and by cutting it in a particular way harnesses its growth energies and actually turns it from a wild plant into a domesticated plant. Let's have the next month. Here we have March, when people have to dig, and let's leave this for a minute, because I mean it obviously looks old-fashioned to us, but just think how modern it would have been to people in those days who were used to drawings of saints and that sort of thing. These are, you know, some of these people, not in this drawing, we're looking at another one. You can actually see bellies here and warts. They're very realistic, human, almost secular pictures. Can we have the next one, please? Now we've got to April, when Easter is usually celebrated, so now it's time to feast. And one of the things that's interesting about Easter is how Easter came to be associated with eggs. We've forgotten, most of us today, that hens only lay when there are more hours of light in a day than darkness. And in fact, in natural conditions, hens stop laying around October and November. Nowadays, of course, we keep the electric light on, don't we? And the poor little things have to knock out eggs all through the winter. But in those days, eggs stopped in the winter, and they didn't appear again until the late March, when after the equinox, you start getting more light than day. So the miracle of eggs appear at Easter time, and you have the miracle of Easter, and that is how the two come to be associated. Can we move on, please? So that's April. Here's May. Here are the sheep. The source of wealth in England. Look at these two shepherds. I don't know if you can see them here, sort of chatting, leaning, talking towards each other. It's a very, as I say, informal, natural sort of drawing. Can we move on? That was May. Here is June. People are gathering wood here. Let's move on. Now this is an interesting month. This is July and the hay harvest. Here's a bald, rather aging reaper who's standing at the side wiping his brow, who's obviously had too much. I should have said, of course, that, and it may come across from my excitement about these lovely drawings, that when I saw these drawings, I knew how to write the book. And when you read the book, you will see that it follows the year. There's 12 chapters in the book. Well, there's a beginning and an end as well. But there are 12 chapters, one for each month of the year. And my publishers actually got these cleaned up versions of the drawings to start off each chapter. And so as you read the book, you will actually live through the year of someone in the year 1000 and see how dependent they were on the weather and how things changed. And this was particularly the case in the month of July, because here are people gathering in the hay harvest. Now, that's all very good, but of course the problem with the hay harvest is it doesn't yield you anything to eat. You gather in the hay harvest to feed your animals in the winter. And one of the things we discovered in the course of doing this book is that July, in fact, was the month, which to us is a very balmy summer month. July was the month in the year 1000 when people were most likely to suffer and even die from famine. Famine today is something we see on television. It affects us, but it doesn't really affect us personally. In the year 1000, famine was a very real phenomenon that actually killed thousands of people every year, if not millions, in Western Europe. And July was the month when it happened because, of course, if you think about it, the actual harvest hadn't come. That was still to come. You couldn't fly in fruit or anything like that, all the things we take for granted today. You were actually dependent on what was coming out of the fields. And at that stage, nothing was. However, we've also discovered that there was a sort of consolation for people in the month of July, because they would make their bread from the increasingly moldy grain that was left in their granaries, particularly rye. And the mold that grows on rye is known as ergot, E-R-G-O-T. And those of you who remember the 60s may remember a substance known as LSD, or lysergic acid. Or maybe you just, I'm sure you just read about it in the papers. Now that was made from ergot. The chemical base of LSD, lysergic acid, is ergot, because ergot is in fact hallucinogenic. And historians have discovered that back in the Middle Ages, people from the moldy grains used to bake a sort of medieval hash brownie that was called crazy bread. And you know those paintings by Bruegel with all the peasants going berserk in the middle of the summer for no obvious reasons? Well, the explanation of that is that they were all on crazy bread, sort of literally enjoying their midsummer madness. And probably actually doing rather better than the lord of the manor, who was drinking wine, which in those days was a much less potent beverage than it is today. Because in the year 1000, there were no airtight bottles, there were no corks. And so the wine was kept in flasks and casks, which were not airtight. So it was rather like Beaujolais Nouveau is today. Rather thin, not very alcoholic, and you had to drink it all up before the next harvest. Can we have the next slides, please? Here we are, finally, here is the harvest. And if you notice, well, you may not have noticed, but there are, in fact, more individuals at work here than in any other drawings in the cycle. This was really the time in August when, obviously, you took advantage of the good weather. It was literally all hands to the, well, the sickle or to the... look at this lovely thing, this cart. Here's a wooden cart actually made from... well, actually rather sophisticated, and for some reasons, the people who lived in the British Isles were well known for their woodwork. The Romans used to praise these carts, which were known as carpenta, and that is what the English word carpenter comes from. Carpentum, leading, and the people who made it were carpenters. Can we move on? Here is September, and we're not quite sure. These are obviously huntsmen going off into the woods, but we're not quite sure if these are really wild boar or the pigs of the time, because the pigs of the time actually were free-range animals, like all animals at that time, and lived quite freely in the woods and would actually breed with the wild boar. And we know from the skulls of domesticated pigs that have been discovered is that their skulls were long and had tusks like this. Now we move on to the next month, which is October, and here it's possible to take a bit of a rest and go hunting. And here are two huntsmen out hunting in the way what people did at that time with falcons. Now, October, the end of the harvest, was also the time when battles could happen, when you can actually get an army together. It's no coincidence that the Battle of Hastings, which occurred in 1066, 66 years after the year we're talking about, when the Normans came over and conquered the Anglo-Saxons, it's no coincidence that that took place in the month of October. Because until then, you couldn't get an army together. You needed all able-bodied men to be out in the fields. Of course, that is, you know, we sort of still have a remnant of that today in the long school holidays, which were devised like that so that children could actually go out and help their parents in the fields in the summertime. And which, interesting, I don't know what people are doing about it in America, but in Britain with the second millennium, one of the plans is actually to abolish the long summer school holiday, because people have finally woken up to the fact that kids aren't going out and bringing in the harvest anymore. Let's move on now. This is November, and again, historians aren't quite sure what it shows. It could obviously, I mean, this character could obviously be a blacksmith making a horseshoe, but another explanation of this drawing is that it's sort of like a cartoon, and that this man here has been stealing from the pile of nicely planed planks that are over here. And here he is again, and he's been arrested. And he's having to undergo the justice system of the time, which is even worse than impeachment, because it was known as the ordeal. And an iron would be heated in the fire, and you'd have to hold it and walk for 8 paces, and then you're allowed to drop it. And you're allowed to bandage it and everything after that, and then it was looked at a week later. And if your hands were all right or were healing, then you were judged to be not guilty, and you went away thankful. And if they weren't healing and had gone septic, and that would probably kill you in any case, you were judged guilty. And outside most villages in the year 1000 in England, we know there were gallows and very summary justice. Now, can we move on just to the last drawing? This is of December, and it shows people winnowing the corn from the harvest and taking it away to the store yards. We're not quite sure whether in the year 1000 people celebrated Christmas quite as we do today. Obviously, as you know, much of the rituals of Christmas that we think of going back time immemorial were devised in the 19th century. But what we do know, and perhaps at this point we could shut off the machine because of the noise it makes. Of course, the other big question we'd like to know about December in the year 1000 is whether they had a Y1K problem as the end of the year approached. Well, we do know that there was a Y1K problem for some people, because the book of Revelation, which was studied in those days as closely as it is today, in chapter 20 talks about the devil being released from his chains after 1,000 years and an age of Antichrist beginning. And as England in those days was experiencing raids from the Vikings, there were some who felt that indeed these raiders coming from out of the seas, taking everybody by surprise, were agents of the Antichrist. And there was a great preacher of the time, Archbishop Wulfstan of York, who was a sort of Billy Graham of his day, who preached a sermon on the subject, which has come down to us. Actually, when you read the sermon, he perhaps wasn't so much the Billy Graham of his day as the Martin Luther King or the Jesse Jackson, because the rhythm with which he declaimed and spoke rings down across the centuries, even through that the Vikings were carrying out. So there were some people who feared the millennium and feared what it would bring. It's interesting, there was a great outburst of church building after the millennium had passed, as if people had been holding their breaths. And one chronicler talks very poetically of a white mantle of churches covering the countryside. More prosaically, people who've studied the churches that were built think that there was sort of gangs, well, not sinister gangs, but groups of Anglo-Saxon workers who would have a sort of identikit church that they would offer to one particular village, and then they build it, and then they take their plans and go and do it in the next village, and so on. But there's another whole school of historians who say that, no, there wasn't a Y1K problem. For a start, of course, most of the population were not literate. Very few people could actually read the Bible. And if, say, you look at the wills that were written by Anglo-Saxons in the 990s, these wills are composed in the serene confidence that the world is going to go on forever. There's no suggestion in them that there's some apocalypse coming. And indeed, when you read the wills, and they're rather wonderful things, written by both men and women, very interesting, and perhaps I'll come on to this later. Well, I shall certainly come on to it later. The way in which women in the year 1000 in England were just as substantial and respected and successful landowners as men were. And you read wills of men who say, well, I've got no sons, therefore I'm leaving my estates to my daughters. Obviously confident and aware that women would be able to exercise authority at that time as effectively as a man, and their authority would be accepted. But the point is that these wills would seem to contradict the idea that there was a great panic. And evidence is a very basic problem when one's writing about the year 1000. One's writing about and looking at what is, in terms of old-fashioned history, called the Dark Ages. English history is always thought to begin with 1066, when William the Conqueror won the Battle of Hastings. And we found this as we compiled the book, Danny Danziger and I, because, among other things, we wanted to write about sex. We wanted to find out, what people used for contraceptives in those days, if they did. And, did they adopt the missionary position or what? And sadly, I have to report we found out very little indeed. Partly perhaps, well, partly because it was a much more private society, and perhaps as well. And that was not really the sort of thing in those days that was actually committed to the written record. And of course, the written record was written by monks, and they weren't supposed to know about that sort of thing in any case. And the contrast with today, of course, is enormous. There are, 37, 38 cartons of papers explaining what one president of the United States got up to in the White House with one young lady. Well, if you took one of those cartons, that would be too much for the documentation, for the transcripts of the documentation about all the documents that survive about England in the year 1000, about everything. I mean, if you want to read Anglo-Saxon poetry, or surviving Anglo-Saxon poetry, I should say, covering the years from the 5th century up to the 10th and the 11th century. You can read it in a morning. I mean, that's the entire surviving corpus of poetry from that time. And when it comes to sex, the only evidence we could discover came, in fact, from the life of a saint of that time, St. Dunstan, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the story is told how there was a king of the 950s, King Eadwig, who was mysteriously missing from his coronation feast. And everybody was terribly upset about this. And Archbishop Dunstan, who just crowned him, took it upon himself to go into the palace and try and discover the king. And he looked in the dining hall, and he looked here, and he looked there, and you've guessed where he found him. He eventually found him in the bedroom. And there in the corner was disrespectfully thrown, as St. Dunstan reported, the crown of England that had just been placed so respectfully on his head. And there was the king disporting himself in bed with a nubile young lady and her mother. So perhaps we shouldn't worry too much about their sex lives. We also discovered from a recipe book, a medical recipe book from the 990s, that there was in fact a Viagra in the year 1000. It was a herb which was known as agrimony. I'll spell it for anybody who's interested. A-G-R-I-M-O-N-Y. It's known colloquially in England as Dyer's Rocket. And perhaps when you read about its alleged properties, you understand why it's called that. According to the recipe book, if you mixed up the agrimony with milk, then it would inflame the male passions. But it was actually better than Viagra because, according to the book again, if a man got too passionate, you could mix up the agrimony with Welsh ale. And then it would have exactly the opposite effect and calm him down, which a Welsh friend of mine said is a cruel slander against Welsh ale. Other evidence, so in the lack of faced with the lack of documentary evidence, what does one do? And one turns to the archaeologists, of course. The archaeologists proved to provide much of the most useful material for our book. One of the most surprising things we discovered, for example, is that the evidence of the bones of people from the year 1000 shows that they were actually about the same size as ourselves. Certainly the same size as a modern Englishman or Englishwoman. Now, of course, that flies in the face of our conventional wisdom about our ancestors, whom we always think of as rather small and shrimpy people. Now, that, in fact, is true of fairly recent ancestors. The average Victorian male, for example, in England was 5'5.5" tall, as compared to the current 1998 average, according to British government statistics, which is 5'9", allowing for tall people, tall men and short men. Well, now, the average Anglo-Saxon man was in fact 5'8", nearly as tall, in other words, as a man living today. And one of the archaeologists told us that you can actually see the Black Death, the terrible plague which decimated the population of England at the end of the Middle Ages. You can almost see it coming in the skeletons as more and more people live in towns and cities develop, and people are overcrowded and more malnourished, and they get smaller until you get the Elizabethans and those small suits of armor that you see in the Tower of London and on to the Victorians. But an Anglo-Saxon, you see, was just one of about 1 million people living in what now is a country that supports 58 million people. The Anglo-Saxons lived in fairly small villages. They really had pretty good diets, very vegetable-based, a lot of beans and pulses, and the meat they ate was all free range. I mean, there was no factory farming in the year 1000. You had to catch your animal to kill it and slaughter it. So it was lean, it was good cholesterol rather than bad cholesterol. There was no sugar in the year 1000. That didn't come till many centuries later, till the Caribbean sugar plantations. So the teeth were very good of people who lived in the year 1000. And then we discovered another source of evidence. Along with the archaeologists, there's a subdivision of the archaeologists who are known as the coprologists. Now, those of you who are classical scholars will know what a coprologist studies, because kopros is the Greek word for dropping, for human droppings. And the coprologists are historians who spend their lives studying the latrine pits of history. There's a particular group of them in England up in York, and I'd recommend anybody who visits England to go to York, not necessarily to look at the latrine pits, but to visit the old Viking town which has been recreated there, and where the evidence of the latrine pits is very important. We discover that the Anglo-Saxons used to swallow their cherry stones and their apple pips, and when that evidence is taken and of course carefully washed and looked at, we discover that the fruit in those days was much smaller than ours is today. We can guess therefore it was sweeter and tastier, not so watery as ours is today. Lot of fish bones, rather painful sort of fish bones in the latrine pits of Anglo-Saxon times. And the other thing is that the latrine pits were almost always situated right at the back door of people's houses. So we must imagine that the human nose operated as a much less prissy organ in the year 1000 than it does today. One of the questions I asked at the beginning is what made people laugh in the year 1000? We discovered the answer. We discovered some riddles. And it made me reflect that really the Anglo-Saxons must have been very good people to take on a desert island with you. Because they were very handy during the day. They'd have been able to build all the things you needed to survive. And at night, they knew how to entertain themselves because they had no television, obviously. And they would retire to their homes when the nights got dark. And they used to tell themselves riddles. Here is a riddle, which I shall read to you. I shall put on my glasses, which of course did not exist in the year 1000. So the windows of people's homes were just were covered with hides and skins. A few of the churches were just starting to get stained glass, but it was a very intensive, expensive sort of process. Here's a riddle from the year 1000. I wonder if you can guess what this is. I am a strange creature, for I satisfy women. I grow very tall, erect in a bed. I'm hairy underneath. From time to time, a beautiful girl grips my skin and puts me in the pantry. At once, her eye moistens. That's the clue, the moistens. It's an onion. I mean, it couldn't be anything else, could it? So you see they had dirty minds in those days, but they also had no four-letter words. You know, people talk about Anglo-Saxon basics. Well, in fact, when you read Anglo-Saxon, Old English, there are no four-letter words. There are no swear words at all. And in fact, the classic four-letter words of English, which I shall not repeat here, actually come from several centuries later and probably actually came across in the age of seafaring and are thought to have come from Holland, in fact. What other things weren't there? There were no buttons in the year 1000. They hadn't been invented yet. People tied up their clothes with thongs. I've mentioned that there was no sugar. There was no spinach. That came to Europe much later from the Crusades. There were none of the fancy greens. There was no cauliflower, no Brussels sprouts. They were all developed later. No broccoli, which doubtless George Bush would have been very happy about. No tea, no coffee, no chocolate. No potatoes, which of course were over here, but had not yet been brought over there to England. No tomatoes either. Nor were there any buildings in England which were more than 1 story high, because stone-built buildings, for domestic buildings at least, stone had not yet started to be used in any serious way. And there's a rather charming entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was the official history of the country kept by scribes in various monasteries, about a meeting of the King's Council held in the 980s, in which they met in one of the King's new manor houses, which actually had an upper story in it, and all the council solemnly trooped into the upper story, whereupon it collapsed, and they all fell on the ground. There were clearly some sort of construction techniques that still had to be mastered. But the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle took great pleasure in remarking that while practically all the council fell to the ground, there was just one character who happened to be standing on a rafter at the time, and that was our old friend St. Dunstan, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who was clearly blessed by his ecclesiastical status, and that was a sign that God was on his side. 1000, of course, actually has a great transatlantic significance, as some of you must know, because the year 1000 was the year when Leif Erikson and his band of Vikings crossed the Atlantic and actually made landfall in Newfoundland. Now, for many centuries, this was written about in the sagas, but wasn't believed by historians who sniffed at it and said it clearly wasn't possible because everybody in those days thought that the world was flat, and there was no way that technologically that could have happened, especially since the sagas talked of a land called Vinland, and Leif Erikson said that he found vines growing. And people said, well, you know, obviously there couldn't have been vines growing at that sort of latitude at any time. And then, 30 years or so ago, archaeologists working in Newfoundland stumbled on a site where there were Viking pots and Viking jewelry and evidence of habitation. And carbon dating showed that these things dated back almost exactly to the year 1000, give or take a year or so. And also discovered were evidence of vines actually growing there. Because, again, a strange thing about the year 1000 and the years around it, it was in fact a time of global warming. We don't know why. There weren't any greenhouse gases to blame in those days. But for about 200 years, there was a period which meteorologists call the Little Optimum, which probably explains why the Vikings were able to get round from Iceland, where they were already in Greenland, through the melting pack ice and down to Newfoundland. And so obviously Leif Erikson didn't think he was going to sail over the edge of the world. And again, when you look at the evidence, you discover that in the age of the Enlightenment, the 17th, 18th century, people look back rather disdainfully at the people of that world. But if you actually read the literature, if you read the writings of King Alfred, the great king of England in the 9th century, he talks about the world as being like the yolk of an egg around which the heavens revolve. Now, he was obviously wrong about the heavens revolving around the earth. Copernicus and Galileo showed that it worked the other way around. But then when you think of emperors at the time, images of them, when they symbolize their power, what do they hold? They hold an orb, showing that they thought that the world was round. And the Venerable Bede, who was the great scholar of the times, also talks of the world being round like a ball. And this is one of the themes of the book, and I'll return to it later, but that we shouldn't patronize the people of those days, and they actually perhaps knew more than we realize. King Alfred, for example, raised money and sent money to the Christian missionaries working in India. This is in the 890s in England, and people knew that there were 3 continents. There was Europe, and there was Africa, and there was also Asia as well. And when the Venerable Bede, the scholar of the times, who actually devised, well, not so much devised as popularized the system of the Anno Domini, the years of grace, which are the basis of the millennium, when he was dying, the chronicles say that he called for his treasures to give them to his most faithful followers, and chief among his treasures were his peppercorns, which had come all the way across the world, and which, of course, were so valuable because they flavored the slightly flavorless meat of the time. One last piece of evidence I just can't resist sharing with you. We came across a manual of monkish sign language, because the monks in the year 1000, as in other times, took vows of silence and were not supposed to speak to each other. And that, of course, poses rather a problem, because if you're a monk and you're having lunch, how do you ask someone to pass the salt if you're not allowed to? Well, that's explained. There are 127 signs in this manual of sign language dating from the 980s. Pass the salt is like that. And pass me the key is like that. And when you talk about the abbot, you tug your forelock like that, which also shows that perhaps the monks had rather longer hair than we realize. I must say it made me think that a gathering of monks at lunchtime must have been rather like a gathering of baseball coaches, with everybody going like this and going like that and looking intently at each other. You realize what I'm saying to you. Perhaps the most fascinating signs come right at the end of the book, because there's a sign like this. Now, what do you think that means when they went like that? Well, that was a sign for a king. And then there was another sign like that, with a sort of sexier wiggle, and that was for a queen. Then you start to think, well, what are monks doing making signs for the king and for the queen? I mean, how does that come into their lives? And that illuminates another sort of deeper theme of the years, and the way in which actually there was an alliance growing, even in these days, well, especially in these days, between the royal family, the monarchy, and the church, which of course exists in England to this day. Because actually, it suited the monarch very well to have a church which respected its authority and in fact preached the authority of the king. It suited the church very well to have a royal family who gave lands for the monasteries. And in fact, in the year 1000, or rather coming up to the year 1000, there are a remarkable number of fringe countries in Europe who all convert, whose rulers all convert to Christianity. The Prince of Russia, the King of Hungary, even up in Iceland, which was ruled by the first parliament of the times. They converted to Christianity actually in the year 1000. And the fact they're all doing it just before the year 1000 sort of contradicts perhaps the earlier argument I made that it didn't matter. Maybe there was a sense of some sort of deadline. Certainly nowadays, to a European or an Englishman, it's rather like all the fringe countries of Europe who are trying to join the common market. In the year 1000, to be Christian was to be modern. There's, again, rather charming account of how in Iceland, the Christian missionaries came and sort of negotiated with the parliament of the time, and the missionaries told about the virtues of Christianity, and the parliament said, well, I don't know, you know, if we become Christian, we would be allowed to eat horses, because at that time in Europe, yes, well, we'll come on later to the education of children in the year 1000 and how they were disciplined. Yes, actually, that's in the monk's manual. There are several signs for whips and cats of nine tails and that sort of thing, which was the way those charming old monks kept discipline in the monastic schools. But anyway, back to Iceland. The Icelandic parliament said to the missionaries, well, all right, we'll become Christian if we can eat horses, because at that time there was a prohibition against the eating of horse meat. And the missionaries thought about it and they said, yeah, well, that's all right. And then they said, and could we go on putting the baby girls out on the hillside? You know, when we have too many girls, could we go on exposing those? And the missionaries thought about that and said, no, no way at all, you can't do that. And so the story then goes, the chronicle then relates that all the members of the the Icelandic parliament went off to an enormous, one of those big mud springs, and they all got in it together and steamed and talked about it and decided, yes, they would become Christian. This sort of rather pragmatic attitude towards becoming Christian and adopting Christianity and setting aside paganism is common to all the countries. The Venerable Bede describes how when the missionaries were sent by Pope Gregory, this is several centuries earlier, of course, to England, to convert England, they were told to look for local habits and customs that might be incorporated, perhaps, into Christianity in order to make it more palatable, and so people didn't find it such of a shock. And I don't know when this program is going to get broadcast, but we're actually talking now tonight, just a few days before Valentine's Day, which is a wonderful example of how the Christian Church, in fact, adopted pagan practices, because everybody who's ever researched the life of Saint Valentine can find no reason at all why he is associated with love and romance. Valentine was a very good Christian who lived in classical Rome and was martyred, killed for his Christian beliefs. But there's nothing in his life to connect him with sex or romance or anything like that. But his name was given by the church to February the 14th, to the middle of February. And it so happened that the middle of February was the date of a very licentious Roman festival, celebrating fertility and copulation and things like that. It was a notorious sort of feast. And in Northern Europe, there was a similar sort of northern pagan festival to do with the dates when birds are first seen to mate in that part of the world. And there was a fertility festival associated with that. And so what seems to have happened is that the church promptly appropriated these festivities and assigned them to St. Valentine. And so he has been the patron saint of chocolates and roses and the candlelight dinners ever since. But there is no Christian reason why he should be associated with those things. At the end of the book, we try to draw some conclusions from all this fascinating material about how people lived, and reflect on the differences between then and now. In some ways, of course, it was a very dramatic change for people then. I mean, people who were literate, I can't quite work out, well, I worked it out in the book and have written it, how the year 999 was written in Roman numerals, which of course were the numerals, were the letters of the time. But it's a long string of letters, I can assure you, and then suddenly, with the year 1000, it becomes one simple M. And of course 2000 will be two M's, which of course is why M&M's are claiming to be the candy of the millennium. And I think it's wonderful that they realize everybody who sees these advertisements can understand Latin numerals. But of course the difference between one M and two M's is that whereas that festivity or anniversary, whatever you like to think of it as one M, just meant something to Christendom and that small corner of Northwest Europe, today 2M means something to cultures all over the world, including cultures which still don't accept or use the Christian calendar. Now, it is partly, of course, because for reasons of economy or whatever, or folly or stupidity 30 or 40 years ago, the computer programmers of the West chose to link the mechanics of computers to this Christian system of dating devised by the Venerable Bede back in Anglo-Saxon times. But it's not just for that reason that the culture that goes with the millennium, the second millennium, has spread. And so, towards the end of the book, we look at what was going on in that little offshore island, misty offshore island. Because you wouldn't have picked, if in the year 1000 you'd been a betting man, and you'd been wanting to bet on the country that was going to make it, or shape events in the next 1,000 years, you wouldn't have picked on Anglo-Saxon England. I mean, you might have picked on Byzantium, which was still a splendid civilization recreating the glories of Rome. You might have picked, and with very good reason, on the Arab civilization that dominated the Mediterranean in the year 1000. Which was keeping alive all the classical texts which were later to inspire the Renaissance. You have Avicenna, the great medical thinker, alive in the year 1000 in the Arab world, and devising medical remedies and theories which far outstrip anything that was going on to the north. But 1,000 years later, that culture has, for better or for worse, spread to much of the world. And what we try to do at the end of the book is to look for some of the reasons why. Well, some of the reasons are right inherent in the work calendar on which this book is based. Work, the work ethic. This calendar is all about organizing people to work and to disciplining your time. It's a religious calendar. It's a calendar of a society of great faith. People at the time had enormous faith. Today, in a less religious age, one might talk about a positive mental attitude. But it was an age that didn't doubt itself. It was a society that didn't doubt itself. Also, and this is more difficult, and non-Englishmen might disagree, but there was something in English society that that allowed for a certain freedom. These other cultures that were so dominant in the year 1000 were more monolithic. They were more authoritarian. In English society, there was an element of consent. The Normans in 1066 were to bring over their feudal system. But when that came to England from Europe, it didn't include, for example, it couldn't possibly have included the notorious droit de seigneur, whereby the lord of the manor was entitled in Europe to bed the young women of the village. That in some way was something that was anathema to the English way of thinking about things. When one looks at the wills of the Anglo-Saxon England, you see this enormous respect for property. You can actually take a will from Anglo-Saxon England and go to the piece of land to which it refers, and you can follow it along the stream and up the hedge and around the forest, because property mattered, and the possession of property mattered very much to those people. And as Edmund Burke said many centuries later, it is in fact in respect for property that economic enterprise has to be based, because unless people can feel secure in the property they gain from their enterprise, they are not going to work as hard as they would. But of all these perhaps slightly theoretical and tendentious themes that can be seen in England of the year 1000, there is also alongside them a very practical reason why English culture was to spread so much. And that is in the language that people were speaking in the year 1000. Which was already starting to take on the flexibility and life of the English of Shakespeare and the Beatles, for that matter. When Neil Armstrong landed on the moon and uttered those famous words, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind, all those words existed in English as spoken in England in the year 1000. Now, we wouldn't have understood it. When you hear Anglo-Saxon spoken, it's as if you're listening to English through a curtain. You can sort of pick out the odd word and the rhythm sounds right. But the main structure of the English language already existed in the year 1000. And without getting too technical, the reason why English at that stage was becoming such a potent and powerful language was because the Anglo-Saxons who first came into England in the 5th century spoke a very basic form of early English. And then a few centuries later, they were followed by the Vikings, who also came from the same part of Scandinavia and northern Germany, speaking a similar but different English. And as these two cultures rubbed against each other and the different grammatical forms tried to coincide, people found it easiest to drop the endings and the complicated genders which characterize to this day French and German. And so the first form of Pidgin English was devised with the simplicity that has spread all over the world. When Winston Churchill wanted to inspire the people of England in 1940, it was Anglo-Saxon to which he turned. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. All those words existed in early English, with one exception. That was the last one, surrender, which was, of course, a French concept, brought across by the Normans. C.S. Lewis, when he talked about history, used to talk about the snobbery of chronology, meaning that it's so easy when you've come later in the story and know what happened to feel superior about the people of the past. We know what happened. We know so much more than them. Therefore, in some way, we must be superior to them. And I think if this book has taught me as an author, one of the co-authors, one lesson, it is the error of that. Because when I reflect on the difficulties of life in those days, I talked, for example, about the splendor of the skeletons, these big strapping people. But then you look at something else. You look at another archaeological remain. You see the bones of a woman who died in childbirth. And there you see in her pelvis the little bones of her baby, which died inside her, which could never get out. And you visualize the hours of fruitless labor and confusion and pain and ending in death. You see the Caesarean operation did exist in the year 1000. Famously, Julius Caesar was saved and born as a result of the Caesarean operation. But it was not an operation in which the mother survived. It was a crude way of saving the life of the baby. And it wasn't until the 18th, 19th centuries even, there's any evidence of women surviving the Caesarean operation. One mustn't be sentimental about life in those days. But then another statistic from the bones, that the brain capacity, the skull capacity of people in the year 1000 was just the same as ours. So they may have put their brains to different purposes, but they were not people that we should patronize. I'd like to finish with just reading just one paragraph from the book. It's about King Alfred, who was the great savior of England in the 9th century when the Vikings were invading. He was like the Winston Churchill of his day, or perhaps better, the George Washington of his day, because as you probably know, when King Alfred was surrounded with his small English army by the Vikings, what he did was to retreat into the marshes of Somerset, rather as Washington wintered at Valley Forge. And he went into hiding, and he spent the winter preparing his tactics for what he would do when the spring came. And he devised the tactics with which he was able to reconquer much of England and to lead to the reconquest of the rest of England by the English. And there's a famous legend known to every English schoolboy of how he took refuge with a farmer and his wife. And the farmer's wife asked him to keep an eye on some cakes that were baking. Well, not so much baking, on an open griddle on the fire. And he was worrying and thinking so much about what he had to do that he let the cakes burn. And King Alfred burning the cakes has entered into English folklore, and interestingly was actually written down for the first time around the year 1000, which we can take as some sort of evidence that he mattered to people and was starting to be a hero. So this is what King Alfred meant to people in the year 1000. By the year 1000, King Alfred had been dead for a century, but he already ranked alongside the Venerable Bede as a shaper of England's developing identity. Itching with intellectual and technological curiosity, the king was anxious to work out the exact time of day. So he invented a graduated candle on which you could mark off the hours as it burned. And then, because his palaces were so drafty, he devised a ventilated cow's horn lantern to put over the top and stop the candle blowing out. At the age of nearly 40, in the midst of what he described as the various and manifold cares of his kingdom, Alfred started to learn Latin so that he could translate some of the key Latin text into English. It seems better to me, he wrote, that we should translate certain books which are most necessary for all men to know into the language that we can all understand, the English language, you see, and also arrange it so that all the youth of free men now among the English people are able to read English writing as well. Alfred's greatest inspiration had been to understand how knowledge liberates, that knowledge is power. The saddest thing about any man, he once said, is that he be ignorant. And the most exciting thing is that he knows. Thank you very much indeed. Now, we have just got a few minutes, I think. If anybody's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, yes?
Yes, I read in one book about the great non-event, and that was when the Pope says, well, the world's going to keep going, and Jesus hasn't come back as yet. Total respect to all religions. Did you come across that about that term, the great non-event? Because everyone was saying the world was going to end.
Yes, well, there was one whole school of chroniclers who describe how people gathered out in the fields, and then the world didn't end, indeed. In fact, what I did come across about the Pope of the time was that he was a man originally called Gerbert of Aurillac. He was a great scholar. And he was a very learned man, and he actually went down to Spain to study what the Moors, the Arabs, were discovering about astronomy and medicine, and the disease of the eye in particular. And he came back with all sorts of Arab innovations, including the abacus, which was the counting machine of those days and which hadn't been used yet in Western culture. And the abacus, of course, is the beginning of people's understanding of modern mathematics. It was rather like the computer, because just imagine trying to calculate in Roman numerals. I mean, how do you multiply MMC by DEF or whatever? Whereas with the abacus, which is sometimes just a sort of you flick a few beads, Or in fact, as it was used in England, you would move counters around a checkered cloth. And that is why, to this day, we have our Chancellor of the Exchequer running the budget, because the Exchequer came from that. Anyway, there was enormous suspicion of Gerbert, who gave himself the name when he became Pope of Sylvester, after the first Pope who converted Constantine. And people said, when they read the book of Revelation, this is the Antichrist, this man bringing in these new inventions. And when he died shortly after the year 1000, they said, well, there you are. I mean, the devil couldn't wait to get him. And there was a legend that Gerbert, when he saw the devil coming for him, like a sort of Dr. Faustus, gave orders that after his death, his body should be cut up so the devil couldn't take it to hell. And this legend had such force that in the 17th century, the Vatican actually ordered that Pope Sylvester's bones should be exhumed. And they were discovered, you will be pleased to hear, to be entirely whole. So the legend was wrong. Yes, sir?
Could you comment on the music of the times?
Yes. Music of the time, very interesting. The writing and notation of music is just beginning around the year 1000. But I'm not aware of any music that can actually be traced in its written form to then. We know, too, that the great ballads of the time were just being written down. Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon epic, was committed to paper at this time. We don't know how many previous generations that have been recited. The music we know most about, of course, is what we today call the Gregorian chant, incorrectly, because Pope Gregory didn't have anything specially to do with it. But it was the chant, of course, with which we're familiar, which has actually topped the hit parade towards the end of this millennium, and which was devised by the early church from Jewish chants, and was the animating noise in, say, a monastery at the time. The monks would pray 7 times a day, and they chanted 7 times a day. And, of course, as they chanted and as they perfected their voices, they were perfecting their voices for the day when they knew that they would be standing in heaven, standing in the presence of God and singing in the same sort of way. And the chant seems to have had almost medicinal purposes in those days. In the infirmaries of the monasteries, which were sort of attached to the monasteries and were sort of guest houses, infirmaries, hospitals, hospices even, there would be the chanting. And so far as one can tell, probably the best, I mean, there were very crude medical remedies in those days and very little understanding of germ theory or anything. And so probably the chanting of the monks was the most therapeutic thing that could be done for people. Yes, sir?
Just going to comment, since the holiday is coming up, you said you weren't sure the connection between Valentine's and the other holiday. As I've read, since I wasn't, I'm happy to say, despite what my kids think, I wasn't around then, that the reason he was saying it is because, in fact, he married Roman soldiers, contrary to the emperor's belief that only single soldiers were better soldiers, and so that in fact, that's why he was martyred, hence why he was saved. I don't know if it's true or just...
Well, I would accept that as a piece of... I'll check it out, but that could well be the case. Thank you very much. Yeah.
I'm sorry to ask another question, but why did women have equal rights in those days? They seem to have more rights then than they did in 1866.
A very good question about, yes, women. I promised to say a little more about that. One of the fascinations of English history for me is the very prominent role that women have played, right from Boadicea, the warrior queen, in the 10th century. One's got a woman called the Lady of the Mercians, who was a sort of Boadicea of her time, who was the daughter of King Alfred. And then you've got Queen Elizabeth, Queen Victoria, and Margaret Thatcher, of course, in our own days. And although we Englishmen are male chauvinists, in some way women managed to master our society at crucial times. And certainly in the year 1000, there were 2 very strong queens. Who knows, incidentally, who was the King of England in the year 1000? Does anybody know? Who that was? Anybody know? No? Anybody know? Well, he was called Ethelred. You may have heard of Ethelred the Unready, because he was so hopeless at coping with the Vikings. Actually, Ethelred the Unready was a name given to him by much later historians. He was actually known at the time as Ethelred Unread. And Ethelred means well-advised, and unread means ill-advised. So he was the sort of well-advised, ill-advised, or the good counsel, rubbish counsel, which sort of was the sort of ambivalent verdict on him. But the point about him was actually he owed his position to a very strong mother, who put him in, who actually seems to be instrumental in organizing the murder of a rival claimant to the throne. And then when he was having such trouble with the Vikings, he decided that he would try and form an alliance with the Viking rulers on the other side of the Channel, the Normans, who of course were of Viking origin. And he married a very strong young lady called Emma, who became Queen of England, but who, interestingly, after his death, had such power that his successor king, King Ethelred, sorry, not King Ethelred, King Canute, married Emma in order to take the authenticity and power that she had. And just one other last thing on women, going back perhaps to a few centuries earlier, but it's very interesting that the first monasteries in England were what were called double monasteries. There were the monasteries for the men and nunneries connected with them for women. And these double monasteries, and there are about 50 of them at one stage in Anglo-Saxon England, were, according to records, always run by the women. The abbesses were always the important figure. Now, when you look further at the evidence, you discover that most of these abbesses were related to royal families. And so that presumably was the source of their status and perhaps where the lands for their foundation came. But still, it was possible in 7th century England for the most learned communities of men to take the orders of women. One last question? Yes.
You said that Christianity was becoming popular. Why was that occurring, and what were they believing before the Christianity?
Well, before Christianity, there were a variety of pagan faiths based very largely on the Norse myths with which we are familiar. It's difficult to find out much about the actual nature of pagan beliefs, because as the Christians came in and as history was rewritten by the scribes of the time, they obviously weren't going to give much time to the faith that they had supplanted. And so it's rather difficult to find out exactly what the character of their beliefs was. But what is interesting about their faith, and I think I'll finish with this one thought, is the way in which their faith gave them the confidence to meet the challenge of the millennium and their Y1K problem. And I actually think that they dealt with their problem better than we are with ours. As a recent article remarked, the problem about the computer bug that we're worrying about now is not so much the technical computer problem, which is getting sorted out, but our worries about the problem and the panic about it, and the way in which the mass media are exploiting that, and all the extra banknotes that are going to have to be printed in order to cope with people rushing to the ATM machines. And you have behavioral psychologists saying, well, let's have the panic now at this stage of year when everybody can raid the shops, and then perhaps by the end of the year people will feel better. And I can't help reflecting that when future historians come to look at us, the supposedly modern and scientific and rational people, and look at how we cope with our millennium, they will say that we've done rather worse than the people back then. So maybe that again is an argument for the snobbery of chronology, and for having a healthy respect for our ancestors. I hope you enjoy reading about your ancestors, my ancestors in the book, and that you learn something from it, as I have. Thank you very much indeed.
And now for anybody who would like a signed copy, we're going to ask that people come around this way to get it. And I'm actually going to take this down so that they'll have space to sign.
We've done this before, so.
There we are. Well, thanks very much. Nice
I'll let you finish this.
Great.
Lovely camera.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Nice to see you.
Likewise.
Yes.
Nick and Ilse. ILSE.
Okay.
Or Ilse, whichever way you prefer.
ILSE.
His father was always so confident, right?
Oh, yeah, I was the Hebrew reason.
Great. Thank you very much indeed.
Excellent.
Hello, sir. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Good.
Make it up to the boy.
For the boys. Okay.
Yeah, she's just
You're Scottish, are you? Oh, yeah. Well, the King of England in the year, the King of Scotland in the year 1000 was called King Kenneth, which I think is rather fun. And then, of course, Macbeth, the wicked Macbeth, was actually born around the year 1000 and became King of Scotland sort of 30, 40 years later. Great, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Hi, nice to see you again. Thank you. Who shall I sign this for?
To Cecilia.
For Sylvia?
Cecilia.
Cecilia. For Cecilia. Well, of course, there was a Saint Cecilia. You know, there was C-E-C-E-C-E-L. Oh, yes, of course it is. There was a Saint Cecilia, wasn't there? But I didn't know what she did. Do you know?
When I was in Chicago, I read about Wallace, if he was called Wallace the Cathedral. He's
Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. So nice to see you again. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye. Thanks. Lovely. Hello. Who should I sign this for?
Oh, for me.
For you? What's your name? For Kathleen.
Kathleen.
K-A-T-H-L-E-E-E-N.
In your talk, you did touch on how it was kind of political that the church was coming in. Most of the history I've ever read is saying.
Yes.
Wondering what else you had discovered.
Well, there's actually relatively little records. What we do know is that the priests were still married then. Most priests were still married, and the church hadn't yet sort of got its grip on social customs. In that, so as far as we know, marriage at the time wasn't conducted in church. You would just have a secular marriage among your family, and you might go to the church porch to get blessed. And thus, correspondingly, divorce was quite easy and wasn't controlled by the church either. Good. Well, thanks very much indeed, Kathleen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. Hello. Good. Who is this? Shall I sign this for you?
Ray Johnston.
Yes. Oh, Ray Johnston. J-O.
A-G-N-S-T-O. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
I'm sure I'll enjoy the practice.
Yeah.
Well, man, you're going 241.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray. Thank you. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi. Who's this for?
Pam.
For Pam, that's you?
Very interesting.
Well, thank you. Are you from Bruce Point?
Yes.
Great place to live. What?
Whole life.
Whole life, eh? Oh, good. Thanks very much, Pam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This way.
Yep.
Why don't you do that to Elaine and Bill?
Elaine and Bill. Okay. E-L-A-I-N-E.
Yes, sir.
She's rubbing it in. She's rubbing it
That's
in.
marvelous, Bill. Yes, very much.
Wonderful speech. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thank you for coming. Hi.
Hi.
Nice to see you. What's your name?
Robert.
Yeah, well, I saw you there smiling away. It's very encouraging.
I
Good.
really enjoyed it.
Thank you. So is this for you?
Robert and Jeannie
All right. You sound English.
from Bath.
Oh, really? I come from Bristol, you know.
Do you really?
When did you leave there?
83.
Really?
Yeah, came to work.
That's actually when I came here, 83, and we just lived here, 3 or 4 years, or 2 or 3 years, and then went back. So, what's your work?
Entertainment stuff.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
What sort of
actually I
stuff?
have a local TV show.
Oh, do you?
I was wondering if you're going to be here for the week.
Well, unfortunately, I'm not. I'm going to Chicago tomorrow. But I come back because I'm a great friend of Jim Nicholson, so perhaps we can arrange something.
Can I give you my
Yes,
card?
please. Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
it's Robert and Jeannie.
Oh, great.
He's also he and Jeannie are our local Millennium
We do
folks here.
predictions.
Oh, are you?
Yeah. I read your palm once, actually, when you visited the Fisher Mansion.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I remember visiting that. Yeah. How funny. J-E-A.
M-I-E.
M-I-E.
He had a fabulous palm.
Well, good.
Yeah.
Well,
Great line of creativity.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I told you you'd make millions of dollars from your
Yes,
creative
well,
skills.
we're still working on that, but it's going well.
Probably getting
That's great,
closer.
you're from Bristol.
Yeah.
I'm actually from Melksham, you know.
Yes, I remember. Yeah. I went to Bristol Grammar School.
Oh, I went to Chippenham.
Did you?
Yeah.
I used to go camping near Chippenham at Slaughterford.
Bristol Grammar School is a great school.
Great school.
Yeah. Thanks a
Lovely
lot,
to meet
Robert.
you.
Yeah,
Well, I'll keep in touch. And,
please, yeah.
I'd
Next
love
time you
to.
come in.
Yes, I will. Thanks
Great.
very much
Thank
indeed.
you.
Thanks. Hello. What's your name? Is this for you? L-A-R-R-A-I-N. Oh, great. Thomas, I'll just put for Lorraine's. Great. Well, thank you very much for coming. Did you just come anywhere, or did you know somebody? Who was, you know Jim? Yeah. Have I met you before at one of Jim's parties? No. Yes, there she is, Lonnie. How are you? Nice to see you. Great. Who is she? Your golf partner? Ah. Hi, Lonnie. How are you? Nice to see you.
Good
Very
to
well.
see you too.
Great.
How did
Looking
you have
fantastic.
time? Yes, thank you. How did you have time to do so much more writing?
Well, yeah. Well, you know, the secret is, someone else did the interviews, and then I just put it together.
Put them down on
Yeah.
paper.
You did one on Diane.
Yes, I did one.
Are you the one that's doing the one on Monica?
No, no.
You wouldn't do that. The fellow that did one on Diane is also doing.
Yes, he is, Morton, and Andrew Morton. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm sure it'll be very good. I'm sure it'll be very good. We'll all read it. We'll all say it's rotten, and we'll all read it. won't we?
No, I haven't seen too much of it. I don't think I'll spend my money
And
there.
heard too much of it too.
So you're a golfer these days, are you?
Yes, a little bit. Skier too?
Yeah, I wish my golf game was indicative of all the time I put into it.
Oh,
but
well,
it
that's what
just-
they always say.
Score just doesn't go down. It stays the
Well.
same.
Keeps the mind active.
Oh, it does, and thank you so much.
Pleasure.
It's good to see you
Nice to
again.
see you too. Hi. Thank you very much. Thank you.
How about to Marvin? And
Yes.
Arlyn.
Well, Marvin.
And mine is A-R-A.
A-R-A.
L-Y-N-N.
Where is that name from?
My father is Armenian, and it's Aras. My mother was Lynn.
Fantastic.
Lynn.
Good. Good.
That's how that happened.
Well, thank you. Yeah, well, the audience sort of was inspiring. Let's put it that way. Everybody seemed so alert. Thank you very much.
Years ago, I lived in rural Ethiopia. And life
Oh,
has
did you?
changed.
No, I
Just
can
like
imagine.
the drawings from the
Yes.
the
Yeah.
flow of life is
Yeah.
no different than
No, and yes, and there's a
I mean,
sort
our
of
piece has changed a lot.
yeah. No, that's right, and you see how.